A common misconception among people who haven't boxed before is that the high guard doesn't cost very much energy. If this were a boxing video game, Abraham's defense here would probably not drain his stamina bar. That's just how we think of the close guard. It's a passive, easy, relatively inactive defense that you can default to when you're tired. But in my opinion, that's a huge misconception, and it's one that falls apart as soon as you get in the ring and try blocking some punches for yourself. Compared to some other defenses that we'll talk about here today, and we've covered elsewhere on our channel, the high guard is not very energy efficient. So there's a few reasons why that's the case. And first, the most obvious, and the one you'll feel right away in that sparring round, is that holding the hands up for extended periods under pressure is tiring. After only 50 seconds of locking himself in the high guard, Abraham is shaking his shoulders out. Now, if you have access to different guards, you can relieve that tension in your shoulders by switching hand positions. And here we see Ward doing just that, moving from a low guard to long guard position. In contrast, Abraham with his one guard is either on or off, light switch style. So he switches off, gives his shoulders a break, switches on, back in the fight, switches off, gives him a break, switches on again, and he attacks. So which would you rather? If you're stuck with the high guard, the only way to rest the shoulders is to turn your defense off. If you have access to multiple guards, maybe you'll drop the lead hand, work some feints or punches, or threaten some lift parries from there, giving the shoulder a break, but continuing to threaten your opponent and keep them at bay. This point's definitely a little controversial, and I know what you're thinking, how can you have better defense with the hands down? You look pretty safe in there. That high guard closes up most of your openings, minimizes your defensive liabilities, and basically covers all of the clean targets your opponent would hope to score on. And that's all completely true. But the high guard also limits your defense in a number of ways, the first of which ties beautifully into my last point about energy efficiency. So unlike the blocks you get from the prevent defense that we covered in the advanced elbow blocks video, your blocking options from the high guard are pretty high impact. Here we see Abraham blocking the jab, preventing it from scoring, but also absorbing a lot of that force. And that jarring impact can really start to wear on you as the rounds go on. That's what I mean when I say the close guard defense is not very energy efficient, especially when you're spending that energy and absorbing that force just to defend a jab. It's just not a good trade. So here Ward is spending very little energy offensively, and he's forcing Abraham to spend quite a bit defensively. A more efficient alternative for Abraham here would be to drop, or rather extend his hands away from close guard into a long guard position, where he could pick off the jab or block it with the forearm well away from his body, dealing with the punch sooner before it picks up speed, or parrying it away altogether is much lower impact and much less draining. But you can't access those long parries or that prevent defense when your hands are glued to your head in high guard. Getting away from the high guard opens up a whole range of low impact defenses. Another way that dropping the high guard can improve defense is by bringing defensive traffic into play. If you haven't seen our other videos on the subject, what defensive traffic boils down to is obstructing your opponent's punching lanes with your gloves. And this is often done just by extending that open hand in a parrying motion to crowd the punch space, but you can also do this with punches of your own, whether they're probing punches or committed power shots. One key with defensive traffic is that it's done proactively, which means rather than waiting for the opponent to punch, you extend your hand into space and control that space.
Just mentally for the opponent, when they see more traffic in front of them, they're less apt to just fly through with a pop shot or even try anything because they know they're going to run into a lot of hands. Okay? Your reflexes are the first thing that goes, so what you want to do is lessen the amount of reflexes you rely on and just start creating traffic and making that much more easier.
Whether you use parries or punches to create your defensive traffic, you have to drop the high guard to do it. Another way the high guard limits your defense is by being much too reactive. By gluing your hands to your head, you essentially surrender control of that space between you and your opponent, sometimes called no man's land. While you hide behind a high guard, your opponent's free to run around, feint, poke you with punches, and otherwise encourage you to stay hidden for longer. That makes you reactive and puts them in control of the pace. Unless your opponent's right on top of you, it's much better to extend the hands, drop the high guard, and take control of no man's land. One great way to do it is with defensive traffic, but you can also use feints or probing punches, which are arguably better for control because feints and punches are just inherently more threatening and they get a larger reaction from your opponent than a hand extended for defensive traffic. Here Ward does an exceptional job of limiting Abraham's punch output. Here defensive traffic denies the jab, Ward keeping Abraham reactive with feints and controlling no man's land by punching into empty space. After disrupting the jab with defensive traffic, Ward is right back to work, keeping Abraham reactive with hard feints. When he wants to exit right, he crowds Abraham's left hand. And when he wants to exit left, he cleverly jabs Abraham's right hand, occupying it, keeping that guard high, and handcuffing Abraham's offense. As we see in these clips, by locking himself in a high guard position, Abraham is just not doing enough to control no man's land. He's handcuffing himself and denying some of his best pacing tools, while giving Ward the freedom to get comfortable, play with setups, change rhythm, and initiate the exchanges right on Abraham's front doorstep. Surrendering control of no man's land is just one more way that gluing your hands in a high guard position limits your defense. Our final point in this section is a quick one, and that's that a static high guard position obstructs your own vision. There's no way around it. When you're holding your hands in front of your face and covering openings, you're also obstructing your own field of vision. And that's a problem that a low hand position or an L guard, or what Ward calls the prevent defense, just doesn't have. In addition to mixing up the angle of attack, there are a number of advanced offensive setups that are only accessible when you drop the high guard. Feints and probing punches are two of the more obvious options, but I'm talking about the subtle arts of trapping and prying. Trapping is about handcuffing your opponent, using the glove to lock your opponent's hand in place where it's unable to counter or defend effectively. Here Ward is trapping Abraham's left with his own to clear the way for his body attack. Prying is about using your gloves or your punches to literally pry open your opponent's guard and create openings for your power punches. Incidentally, this is one of the best offensive setups you can use against people who over-rely on that static high guard defense. When people are gluing their hands to their forehead, they're typically not too focused on hand fighting, so you can reach into that person's space relatively uncontested and start to work all of your traps and pries. Once you land a few shots, or even just rip their hand down for a second, they'll no longer feel very safe in that high guard position, and you'll have taken away one of their primary resting positions. Should you always box with the hands down? Of course not. But you shouldn't always box with the hands up either. Doing so only burns out your shoulders, limits your defense, surrenders control of no man's land, and makes your punches that much easier to read. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for weekly boxing technique tips, and feel free to request future topics in the comments section below.